I learned biology in school, like many of you, and this is a simplified version of cell I learned back then. What we can see here is chromosome. Chromosome essentially a wrapped DNA with some proteins holding it together. And now we are going to move out of chromosome and see how the cell divides. And the division of the cell is what essentially means ability to multiply in evolutionary sense. Those white lines, by the way, are microtubules, which are very important in this process. So let's see how the cell divides. This is approximately how it would look like under microscope. As you can see, the chromosomes, identical chromosomes, are split in two groups. Those white dots show in which directions they need to move. Well, who orchestrates those white dots is an interesting question in itself. And now we got two cells. This is a chromosome, and those white lines are microtubules that control the process of division of the cell. So that red region is where the microtubules attached to a chromosome. And the role of microtubules is to essentially transmit signals, chemical signals, and orchestrate the whole very complex process of cell division. As you can see here, everything moves in molecular world, and all kinds of proteins and amino acids and all kinds of other chemicals are moving around. Now, to do that, the microtubules transmit not only signals, they also apply physical force too, because they can stretch. And now, for example, we can see that the signal was synchronized across all the microtubules, that the process can start to divide the cell. And you can see those little soldiers that walk on microtubules. And this is real. This is what is going on right now in every cell of your body. And they really walk like that. These molecules can walk. And they transmit, they have, on the top they have an attached protein or some other chemical, and they just transmit it from one place to another. That's our transportation system. And here it's under microscope. We can see how packages being delivered by microtubules at high speed. And this is a road system with trucks that deliver packages in a cell. Why did I show all of it to you in a simulation theory related video? You see, there is a Fermi paradox that says that we should have received intelligent life originated signals from outer space in some kind of form, and we didn't receive anything by now. Even because we discovered so many Earth-like planets, it's just impossible that we didn't receive a single signal from some other intelligent life. So that draws me to a conclusion that we are the only life in this system that we live in. And origin of life is very important for simulation theory in that sense. Now, there is a group of creationists who advocate that, for example, evolution didn't happen at all, and so on. I don't want to be involved in that kind of debate. Instead, for me, only the first cell matters. So, if we could prove that the first cell was actually designed, and therefore life was created, and then maybe evolution happened in a classical sense, and so on, that will be a good enough theory for me and for simulation theory in general. This picture you see here comes from creationists such as Behe. He was attacked quite a lot by scientific community. So I think he advocated for full-blown creationism and completely denied evolution at all. So I don't know about that. But his argument of reducible complexity is still good in many other ways for us. He presented this example of a mouse trap, and he said that all elements of mouse trap, all of them, need to come together for mouse trap to work. So remove any of the element and it will be a useless device. Therefore, evolution couldn't have happened in a cell. And he gives this example of flagellum. It's a biological machine in many cells that allows them to move. So this thing spins here, and this is the rotor and a stator, and they spin, and this filament moves and allows the cell to swim through the liquids. He gives this example, giving it as it's reducibly complex. You need all elements to come together for this machine to be useful, so it cannot evolve. Unfortunately, he picked pretty bad example because it turned out the proteins in this part are used for other means, and this part was used, I think, for injection mechanism to inject liquids. So it was reduced a little bit. So that's not the best example. The example I gave you with the actual division of a cell is truly reducibly complex. Essentially, for evolution to work, you need something to multiply over time. And how can you multiply if multiplying requires so many steps and such a complexity? This is a tree of life that I learned in school. And as you can see, some primitive bacteria and infusoria, for example, being here single-cell organisms and so on, primitives. And then as we go high, we get the vertebrates, mammals, and then man at the top. That's a classical evolution picture that I learned in school. Turns out this tree of life is not valid anymore at all. This is a modern tree of life. It was created by using statistical analysis of DNA in UC Berkeley, and essentially what we have it doesn't even look like a tree anymore, but we have this huge bacteria section here. Then we have single-cell weird organelles that live in volcanoes and geysers. And then we have eukaryotes, right here, the green ones, which actually include humans, plants, not a tree of life, honestly speaking. Moreover, facts like salamander and onion have more DNA material than humans, and chicken and banana have 60% of human DNA. It's a mess. It has nothing to do with tree anymore. To move to the next argument, I need to give you a very basic introduction how DNA manages to produce proteins. So the basic explanation is like this. We have this organelle called ribosome. It's essentially an RNA molecule with some proteins around it. It's a mechanism which has 3 slots, perfectly designed slots for 3 tRNAs. These yellow ones are tRNAs. This is a kind of picture of tRNA here on the side. And they have a key, a 3-letter key that matches the keys on mRNA. mRNA is what a piece of DNA is that was put in this ribosome. And essentially this key matches the code on mRNA. And each of these tRNAs on the top, this ball, they have one amino acid, specific amino acid. So this key, 3-letter key, matches one of the 20 amino acids. So they arrive here and they then connect to the chain, producing this long chain protein. I hope you all know what protein is, obviously. It's a long chain of amino acids. can see this little animation, how it happens dynamically. And as you can see, the new tRNA, these big blue ones are tRNAs, and on the top of them there is a tiny amino acid that being added together in a ribosome. This black stripe is essentially mRNA that has the code for that specific protein. There is an ongoing experiment called Lanskys long-term evolution experiment that lasts already for 25 years. This experiment essentially started with a colony of bacteria, and we allowed all this 60,000 or so generation of these bacteria evolve in a lab, and we just watched how it evolves and adapts to environments. And this experiment is probably the most important proof of evolution at work. Relatively recently, we discovered that bacteria started to be able to utilize a so-called CIT plus gene, which allows bacteria to multiply and grow more efficiently in the specific citric environment. Now, what turned out to be interesting is that this gene was already in the DNA of this bacteria and was simply turned on. So it got activated after a few mutations. Now, mutation is a very generic term, turns out, these days. Mutation can mean change in coding section of DNA, which would essentially produce a different kind of protein. Then it could be a change in so-called genetic expression, meaning how certain RNAs are being expressed during translation. And then also the so-called methylation is another way that DNA essentially changes. So all these different changes, they all modern scientists, by some reason, call them all evolution, which deviates from classical understanding of evolution. Because when I was in school, evolution meant random mutations in DNA that happen to be, some of them, most of them will be not useful or bad for the organism, but some turn out randomly to be useful, and then those who got useful change in DNA, they will thrive and multiply, and those who have bad changes will die out. So that's how evolution works. So that's what I studied in school. But what turns out, these mutations now, especially this one is very interesting, because here gene, essentially the RNA that coded that specific protein that needed to be produced, it was already there, and in the DNA simply was enabled. So this enablement, you could argue it was random, or maybe it was not random. It's really, we don't really know 100% if it was random. And I would say that nobody was able to actually see creation of completely new protein by an organism completely randomly in a lab condition. The only mutations, the good mutations that we see, seem to be dealing with amplifying or suppressing certain genes. So it's almost like a regulatory system. And it's not, regulation is not really true evolution in my understanding. So interesting, very interesting. Now let's look at this. We have randomly enabled, disabled, amplified, or suppressed genes. Again, we didn't see in any experiment that new genes, useful genes were created. So only we deal really with this, enable, disable, amplify, and suppress genes. And moreover, it's not even random, because recent experiments show that when environment changes, the cell begins to begin this mutation process in a more aggressive way. So more mutation happens when there is a change in environment. It's almost like pre-programmed reaction by a cell to start changing things, because environment changes. Let me randomly change as much as possible, and maybe one of the my copies will be very successful in this new environment. It's almost like pre-programmed reaction. Isn't it interesting? So anyway, some of these black dots emphasize changes, and most of them are random, and these are turned out to be bad organisms. They will probably die out, but this one turns out to be better, more beneficial, so it will multiply. Hold this thought for a second and look at this. This guy developed an algorithm to find the shortest path between 2 points, and dots are, of course, some kind of problems in this maze. And as you can see, randomly his algorithms find the shortest path, trying all kinds of different ways. This to me works exactly like cells work when environment changes. They randomly search for the best solution. They don't create the actual algorithm. Notice that point. That guy on the left wrote the algorithm. There is one big hope in scientific community to explain the first cell is so-called RNA World Hypothesis. And it is based on a ribozyme that was discovered in cell. This ribosome is a relatively small molecule, and it is main functional part in ribosomes that we saw earlier. This molecule is essentially a piece of RNA which has dual purpose. It is functional like protein, but also has a coding ability like RNA. So it's the hypothesis essentially says that the first molecules, first random RNAs that were just randomly happened, then suddenly learned to self-replicate and then evolved into more complex structures, finally learning how to do proteins, which are more efficient building blocks. Now this argument, it's fine. I mean, it's a fair argument, but to me it looks more like the sticks animation here. So what you can see here is essentially water pool, and there is a swirl there of water, and just randomly some sticks fall down into this nice structure. It's totally believable, and I'm fine with that. Can you imagine the same happening and building a house? That is very unlikely in my sense. I think a house could be built more likely this way. So what is more believable, the previous way to build a house or this way? I would say this way is more believable. Just like with quantum mechanics and cosmology, simulation theory has this unifying power. It looks like it can actually unify the evolutionary view of the world and creationist view of the world. We could easily admit that evolution happened, that we evolved from apes and so on, but we also can see that the cells themselves could have been created, and more likely have been created by intelligence than actually randomly appeared. And all the facts point to that, especially recent facts such as discoveries that mutations become more frequent when environment changes, and all the discoveries how complicated the molecular biomachinery is, because Darwin of course had no clue how complicated a single cell is to just be able to replicate itself. It's just unbelievably complex. There is another beautiful side of simulation theory, because it suddenly looks like our life is not senseless. It looks like Earth again is a biological center of the universe. Thank you.